When 52-year-old Martha Clearwater bought 160 acres of seemingly worthless desert land in Nevada for just $400, her own family called her crazy. But when her desperate search for water led to the discovery of a hidden vault containing over $2.3 million in gold coins, rare artifacts, and cash, she proved that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most extraordinary rewards. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Reno, Nevada, as Martha Clearwater sat in her rusted Honda Civic outside the county courthouse. Clutching a crumpled newspaper clipping in her trembling hands, the headline read, "Foreclosure auction today, property starting at $400. For most people, this would be an opportunity. For Martha, it was her last hope. 6 months earlier, Martha's world had collapsed like a house of cards. Her husband of 28 years, Robert, had died suddenly of a heart attack at age 55, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt that their insurance barely touched. The hospital bills alone totaled over $180,000, and that didn't include the mortgage payments they'd fallen behind on during Robert's final months when Martha had taken unpaid leave to care for him. I remember sitting in that car, looking at the courthouse steps, and thinking, this was it, Martha would later recall. I had exactly $847 in my checking account, and my house was going into foreclosure in 30 days. My daughter Jessica kept calling from college, worried sick about me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her how bad things really were. Martha's financial situation was dire, but it wasn't unique. Medical bankruptcy affects over 500,000 American families each year, and widows are particularly vulnerable. The sudden loss of a spouse's income, combined with end-of-life medical expenses, creates a perfect storm of financial devastation. What made Martha's story different was what she did next. The courthouse steps were crowded with real estate investors, bargain hunters, and desperate people like herself. Martha had done her research the night before, scrolling through online listings of properties that would be auctioned. Most were either commercial buildings with liens or residential properties in terrible condition. But one listing caught her. 160 acres of undeveloped land in Pershing County, Nevada, about 2 hours northeast of Reno. The description was brutal. Martha laughed, remembering that day. It said barren desert land, no utilities, no water access, no road access, no structures. It's buyer responsible for all development costs. It was basically a warning to stay away. But Martha saw something others didn't. The land was located near what used to be a mining region in the early 1900s. Her late husband, Robert, had been fascinated by Nevada's mining history, and had often talked about the fortunes made and lost in the silver and gold rushes. More importantly, the property taxes were only $120 per year, which meant even if she couldn't develop it, she could afford to hold on to it. The auction began at 10 a.m. sharp. Martha watched as property after property sold for thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Professional investors bid with confidence, flipping through thick folders of research and making quick calculations. On their phones? Martha felt increasingly out of place among these seasoned buyers when the auctioneer called out, Lot 47 to 160 acres, Pershing County, coordinates 40.2431 N. 118.4956 W. The crowd barely stirred. A few people glanced at their paperwork, but no hands went up when the bidding opened at $1,000. Do I hear $1,000? The auctioneer called. Silence. How about $800? Still nothing? $600? The auctioneer's voice carried a note of frustration. Martha's heart pounded as the price dropped. This was her chance, but doubt crept in. What if her family was right? What if she really was making a terrible mistake? $400? Do I hear $400 for this 160-acre parcel? Martha's hand shot up before she could talk herself out of it. I have $400. From the lady in the blue jacket, do I hear $450? The seconds ticked by. Martha held her breath, simultaneously hoping someone would outbid her and praying they wouldn't. Going once... going twice. Sold to bidder number 73 for $400? Just like that, Martha Clearwater owned 160 acres of Nevada desert. The total cost, including fees and taxes, came to $467. She had $380 left to her name. The reaction from her family was swift and brutal. Her daughter Jessica called that evening, her voice tight with concern and anger. "Mom, what have you done? Dad's been gone 6 months, and now you're throwing away money on some worthless desert land. You need to be practical. You need to sell the house, find a small apartment, and figure out how to make ends meet." Her sister Linda was even more direct. "Martha, I love you, but you've lost your mind. That land is worthless. You just threw away $467 that you desperately needed for food and bills." Even her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who had been supportive during Robert's illness, shook her head when Martha told her about the purchase. "Honey, grief makes us do strange things. Maybe you can still get your money back." But Martha had made her decision, and despite the criticism, she felt a strange sense of peace about it. For the first time since Robert's death, she had taken control of her own destiny, even if that destiny was uncertain. 2 weeks later, Martha made her first trip to see her property. The drive from Reno took her through increasingly desolate terrain. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that her Honda struggled to navigate. She had printed out satellite images from Google Maps, but they hadn't prepared her for the reality of what she'd bought. The land stretched endlessly in all directions. A seemingly barren expanse of sagebrush, scattered rocks, and red dirt. There were no trees, no buildings, no signs of civilization, except for a few rusted fence posts marking the property boundaries. The silence was profound. No traffic, no voices, just the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. I stood there for probably an hour, just looking, Martha remembered. Part of me wanted to cry. It looked like the surface of Mars, but there was something else too, a sense of possibility. This was mine. All 160 acres of it. Martha spent the afternoon walking the property, trying to get a sense of its layout and potential. The land wasn't completely flat. There were gentle rises and shallow depressions that suggested water might collect during rare rainfall. She found the remnants of an old dirt road that had once crossed the property, now mostly reclaimed by nature. More intriguingly, she discovered several piles of rocks that didn't look entirely natural. They were arranged in rough circles, as if they had once been foundations or markers. Robert's stories about Nevada's mining history came flooding back. Had there been activity on this land before? That evening, Martha drove to the nearest town, a tiny community called Lovelock, about 40 miles away. She found a small diner and struck up a conversation with the waitress.
Oh.
A weathered woman named Betty who had lived in the area her whole life. "You bought the old Hendricks place?" Betty asked when Martha described her property's location. "That land's been empty for decades. My grandfather used to tell stories about activity out there in the 1920s, but nothing ever came of it." "What kind of activity?" Martha pressed. "Oh, you know how it is with these old desert stories. Prospectors, claims. People always thinking they'd strike it rich. Most of them went bust. But there were rumors. ... Betty trailed off, refilling Martha's coffee cup. "What kind of rumors?" "There was this one fellow, name of Jeremiah Hendricks. He owned a big chunk of land out there, including what you bought. He was convinced there was silver in them hills. Spent years digging, brought in equipment, the whole 9 yards. Then one day in 1923, he just up and disappeared. Left everything behind." Martha felt a chill despite the warm diner. Disappeared? That's what they say? Some folks thought he struck it rich and moved on. Others figured the dessert got him. It can be cruel to people who don't respect it. His property eventually got sold for taxes, then sold again, then forgotten about. Driving back to Reno that night, Martha's mind raced. She had bought the land hoping to find some way to make it pay for itself, maybe by selling it to someone else eventually. But Betty's story suggested there might be more to the property than met the eye. Over the next few weeks, Martha threw herself into research. She spent hours at the Nevada State Library, poring over old mining records, geological surveys, and newspaper archives. What she found was fascinating. Jeremiah Hendricks had indeed been a real person, and he had been far from a typical desert prospector. According to records, He had been a successful businessman from San Francisco who had invested heavily in Nevada mining operations. He had purchased over 800 acres in Pershing County in 1919, convinced that the area contained valuable mineral deposits. The newspaper accounts painted a picture of a man obsessed. Hendricks had brought in professional mining equipment, hired experienced miners, and spent enormous sums of money on his operation. For 4 years he had worked the land, following geological surveys and chasing promising mineral traces. Then, in September 1923, the Reno Evening Gazette ran a small item. Jeremiah Hendricks, mining entrepreneur, reported missing from his Pershing County operation. Equipment and personal effects left behind. Sheriff's investigation ongoing. There was no follow-up story, no resolution. Hendricks had simply vanished, leaving behind his substantial investment and, according to one account, personal effects suggesting a hasty departure. Martha found herself wondering, what had Hendricks discovered? What had happened to him? Research consumed her evenings and weekends. She learned about Nevada's complex geology, the signs that indicated promising mineral deposits, and the techniques used by early 20th century prospectors. She studied satellite imagery of her property, looking for patterns that might indicate past mining activity. More importantly, she began to formulate a plan. If Hendricks had been convinced there were valuable minerals on the property, maybe he had been right. He had even found something. And if he had disappeared suddenly, leaving his equipment and personal effects behind, maybe there were clues still waiting to be discovered. Martha's savings were dwindling rapidly. The foreclosure on her house was proceeding, and she would need to find somewhere else to live within the month. Her family's concern was turning to alarm as she spent more time researching Hendricks and less time looking for practical solutions to her financial crisis. But Martha had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of fighting the foreclosure and trying to maintain her old life, she would embrace her new reality. She would move to the desert property and live there while she explored its potential. Everyone thought I'd finally snapped, Martha said. My daughter threatened to have me declared incompetent. My sister staged what she called an intervention. But I had this feeling, this certainty, that I was on the right path. The practical challenges were enormous. The property had no utilities, no water, no shelter. The nearest town was 40 miles away. Martha would be living in one of the most isolated and harsh environments in the United States. But Martha had advantages that Hendricks hadn't possessed. Modern technology meant she could have solar panels for electricity, a satellite internet connection, and GPS navigation. She could order supplies online and have them delivered to Lovelock for pickup. Most importantly, she could research and plan her exploration, using resources that hadn't existed in 1923. Martha used the last of her money to buy a used travel trailer and basic supplies. She hired a contractor to tow the trailer to her property and set up a simple solar power system. She installed a composting toilet and arranged for water delivery from a company in Lovelock. The day she moved onto the property, Martha felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was 52 years old, recently widowed, nearly broke, and about to begin living alone in the Nevada desert. By any reasonable standard, she was making a terrible mistake. But as she sat outside her trailer that first evening watching the sun set over her 160 acres of seemingly worthless land, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Hope. She had no idea that within 6 months, her desperate gamble would lead to one of the most extraordinary treasure discoveries in Nevada history. She had no idea that her search for water would uncover secrets that had been hidden for nearly a century. And she had no idea that her $400 investment would ultimately be worth more than she had ever dreamed possible. All she knew was that she had taken control of her own destiny, and for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The desert was silent around her, holding its secrets close. But Martha Clearwater was patient, determined, and had nothing left to lose. It was a combination that would prove to be more powerful than she could have imagined. Martha's first month, living on the desert property, was a brutal education in survival. The Nevada desert didn't care about her financial problems, her grief, or her determination. Tested her every single day with relentless heat, bone-chilling nights, and an isolation so complete that the silence itself became oppressive. Her daily routine began before dawn. The desert temperatures in early summer could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit by noon, making any physical work impossible during the day. So Martha would wake at 4:30 a.m., make coffee on her small propane stove, and spend the cool morning hours exploring her property and documenting what she found. The first challenge had been water. The delivery service from Lovelock charged $200 for a 500-gallon tank, which lasted Martha about 3 weeks if she was extremely careful. That meant no showers, minimal washing, and constant awareness of every drop she used. She quickly learned to take desert baths with wet wipes and to wash dishes with barely a cup of water. I'd never realized how much water I used for everything, Martha reflected. Brushing teeth, washing hands, cleaning dishes, it all adds up. I was using maybe 5 gallons a day, and I felt like I was being wasteful. But the water situation also focused her mind on her primary goal, finding a reliable water source on the property. If she could drill a well and hit water, she could solve her immediate survival needs and potentially make the land more valuable. The question was where to drill. Martha had purchased a used metal detector and a small geological pick from a pawn shop in Reno. Every morning, she would systematically explore different sections of her property, looking for signs of past human activity or geological features that might indicate underground water. The metal detector proved immediately useful. Within her first week, she had found dozens of metal objects scattered across the property: rusted cans, pieces of old machinery, nails, and fragments of tools. Most were worthless junk, but they painted a picture of more extensive past activity. Then the barren landscape suggested. More intriguingly, the finds weren't randomly distributed. They clustered in 3 main areas, suggesting specific sites where people had lived or worked. The largest concentration was near the center of the property, where Martha had noticed those circular rock formations on her first visit. Using a notebook to catalog every find, Martha began to see patterns. The metal objects in the central area included pieces of mining equipment, drill bits, metal cables, and fragments of machinery that looked far more sophisticated than typical prospecting tools. This supported the story about Jeremiah Hendricks bringing in professional equipment, but it was in the second area, toward the eastern edge of her property, that Martha made her first truly significant discovery. She had been working that section. On a particularly hot morning, sweating through her clothes despite the early hour, when her metal detector gave a strong, consistent signal. The reading was different from the scattered debris she'd been finding deeper, more substantial, digging. In the rocky soil was backbreaking work. Martha's hands, soft from years of office work, quickly developed blisters and cuts. But after 40 minutes of careful excavation, her shovel struck something large and metallic. What she uncovered was a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of heavy-gauge steel and secured with a rusted but still functional lock. The box was in remarkably good condition, protected by the dry desert air from the corrosion that would have destroyed it in a more humid climate. Martha's hands shook as she carried the box back to her trailer. This was the first concrete evidence that people had not just worked on this land, but had buried things here. The implications were staggering. The lock proved surprisingly easy to break with a hammer and chisel. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected them for decades, Martha found a collection of documents and photographs that would change everything she thought she knew about her property. The documents were surveying reports, geological assessments, and mining claims, all dating from 1921 to 1923. But these weren't the rough notes of a desperate prospector. They were professional reports typed on letterhead from Hendricks Mining Consortium in San Francisco, California, and signed by certified geologists and mining engineers. The reports painted a picture of a far more sophisticated operation than Martha had imagined. Hendricks hadn't been gambling on hunches. He had been following scientific evidence. The geological surveys identified multiple promising sites across the property, with detailed analyses of soil samples, mineral traces, and underground formations. But it was the photographs that truly captured Martha's attention. Black and white images showed the property as it had been in the early 1920s, with wooden structures, mining equipment, and work crews. In one photo, she could clearly see the circular rock formations that still existed today, but in the 1920s, they had been the foundations of substantial buildings. Most intriguingly, several photographs showed excavation work at various sites across the property. One image, dated September 1923, showed a large hole surrounded by mining equipment and piles of excavated material. The back of the photograph was annotated in neat handwriting, Site 7, promising formations encountered at 30 feet. Martha spent hours studying the documents and comparing them to her mental map of the property. The locations described in the reports corresponded to the areas where she had been finding metal debris. But according to the photographs, the excavation work had been far more extensive than the current landscape suggested. What had happened to all the equipment and structures shown in the photographs? Where were the excavated sites? Most mysteriously, what had Hendricks found that had caused him to disappear so suddenly? The answer to the first question became clear as Martha continued her morning explorations. The desert had reclaimed most evidence of human activity, but once she knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere. Depressions in the ground marked where buildings had stood. Unusual plant growth indicated where organic materials had been buried. And most significantly, she found several areas where the ground had clearly been excavated and then filled back in. The largest of these filled excavations was located exactly where the September 1923 photograph had been taken. Martha marked the spot with a GPS coordinate and began the careful process of investigating what lay beneath. But first, she needed to solve her more immediate problem: water. The geological reports in Hendricks' buried box included detailed information about underground water sources. According to the 1922 survey, there were 2 potential aquifers beneath the property. One was relatively shallow, at about 60 feet depth, but showed signs of seasonal variation and possible contamination from surface minerals. The other was much deeper, at approximately 180 feet, but appeared to be part of a larger underground system that would provide consistent, clean water. Martha had been living on the property for 6 weeks when she made the decision that would change everything. She was down to her last $1,200, money she had planned to use for food and supplies through the summer. But the water situation was becoming critical. Delivery costs were eating up her limited funds, and she was constantly worried about running out. More importantly, she was starting to believe that finding water wasn't just about survival. It was the key to unlocking the property's real potential. The geological reports suggested that whoever could access the deeper aquifer would have a significant advantage in developing the land. Against every reasonable instinct, Martha decided to spend her remaining money on drilling a well. Finding a well drilling contractor willing to work on such a remote property proved challenging. Most companies wanted substantial upfront payments and were skeptical about the likelihood of finding water. But Martha finally found a small outfit run by a grizzled veteran named Tom Rodriguez, who was intrigued by the challenge and willing to work for partial payment up front. "Lady, I've been drilling wells in Nevada for 30 years, Tom told her during their first meeting. "I've seen plenty of folks chase water in the desert, and most of them go broke doing it. But you've got something most of them don't have: actual geological surveys. If these reports are accurate, you might have a real shot." Tom's equipment arrived on a blazing hot Tuesday morning in July. His truck-mounted drilling rig looked impossibly large and sophisticated compared to Martha's simple trailer setup. She watched nervously as Tom and his assistant, a young man named Carlos, began setting up the equipment at the coordinates she had specified based on the geological reports. "We're going to start with the shallow target," Tom explained. "We hit water at 60 feet. That might be enough for your needs and a lot cheaper than going deep. If not, we'll reassess." The drilling began with a deafening roar that shattered the desert silence. Martha had never realized how loud industrial equipment could be, or how the sound would carry across the empty landscape. She found herself wondering what the noise might disturb in this isolated place. Progress was slow. The desert soil was harder than expected, layered with rocks and clay that challenged even Tom's professional equipment. By the end of the first day, they had reached only 30 feet. The good news is, we're seeing some interesting formations, Tom reported that evening. Your geological survey was right about the layering. The bad news is, this is going to take longer than I expected. Martha spent that night lying awake in her trailer, listening to the desert silence and wondering if she was making another terrible mistake. She was now committed to paying Tom regardless of whether they found water. If the well came up dry, she would be completely broke with no backup plan. The second day brought better progress. Tom's drill bit chewed through softer soil, and by noon they had reached 50 feet. But more importantly, they began encountering signs that encouraged Tom's professional eye. The soil samples are showing moisture content, he told Martha. And look at this. He held up a handful of dirt from the drill core. See how it's darker? That's a good sign. We're getting close to something. At 62 feet, they hit their first water. The moment was less dramatic than Martha had expected. There was no gusher, no sudden rush of water to the surface. Instead, Tom's instrument simply showed that the drill had penetrated a water-bearing layer. It's there, Tom announced, but it's not great. Flow rate is low, and the water's got a lot of minerals in it. Probably seasonal too, might dry up in drought. Years, Martha felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. They had found water, which solved her immediate survival problem. But it wasn't the abundant, clean source she had hoped for. What about going deeper, she asked. The geological report mentioned another aquifer at 180 feet. Tom considered. This, studying the geological surveys Martha had shown him, it's possible, but it's also expensive. We're talking about another $3,000 minimum, and there's no guarantee we'll find anything better. Martha looked at her calculations. The shallow well would cost $2,800, money she barely had. Going deeper would require finding additional funding somehow. But the geological reports had been accurate so far. The deeper aquifer was described as extensive and high quality. Let's do it, Martha decided. If we're going to gamble, let's gamble big. Tom raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? That's a lot of money to risk on a maybe. I've been risking everything since I bought this land, Martha replied. What's a little more? But finding the additional money proved nearly impossible. Martha's credit cards were maxed out, and no bank would loan money to an unemployed widow living in a trailer in the desert. Her family refused to help, convinced she was throwing good money after bad. It was Carlos, Tom's young assistant, who suggested a solution. My uncle runs a small investment group, he told Martha. They look for unusual opportunities. Maybe they'd be interested in a partnership. The uncle, Vincent Morales, turned out to be a shrewd businessman who had made money in various ventures around Nevada. When Martha explained her situation and showed him the geological reports, he was intrigued. Here's what I'll do, Vincent proposed. I'll front the money for the deep drilling. If we hit water, you pay me back at cost, plus 20%. If we don't find water, I eat the loss. But if we find something really good, a high-flow aquifer that could support development, I want a 25% stake in the property. It was a risk, but Martha was out of options. She agreed to Vincent's terms, and the deep drilling resumed. The work was even more challenging than the shallow drilling. At 100 feet, they encountered a layer of extremely hard rock that dulled Tom's drill bits and slowed. Progressed to a crawl. At 130 feet, they hit a pocket of pressurized gas that forced them to stop work for safety reasons. I've never seen geology quite like this, Tom admitted. It's like the land doesn't want to give up its secrets. But at 165 feet, something changed. The drill bit suddenly dropped through what felt like empty space, and the drilling mud began circulating differently. That's interesting, Tom muttered, studying his gauges. We just hit some kind of void. At 175 feet, they struck water, and not just any water. The flow rate was 10 times higher than the shallow well, and the water was crystal clear. Lady, you just hit the jackpot, Tom announced, grinning broadly. This is the kind of aquifer that can support a small town. Martha felt tears of relief streaming down her face. After months of struggle and uncertainty, she finally had something solid, abundant, clean water that transformed her property from a liability into a genuine asset. As Tom continued drilling to assess the full extent of the aquifer, his equipment encountered something unexpected at 182 feet. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, studying his instruments. The drill bit just hit something metal, something big. Carlos peered at the readings. Could be an old pipe or something from the mining days. But Tom shook his head. "This is different. The metal's thick, and it's not moving. It's like we hit a wall." Martha felt her heart racing. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," Tom replied. "But I've never seen anything like it. Whatever's down there, it's substantial. It's not natural." The three of them stared at the drilling equipment, each lost in their own thoughts. They had been looking for water and had found it. They had also found something else, something that had been hidden 182 feet beneath the Nevada desert for decades. "Should we try to drill around it?" Carlos asked. Tom considered this. "We could, but honestly, I'm curious now. Whatever's down there, it's big enough to block our drill." "That's not normal." Martha made a decision that would haunt her for weeks. "Let's mark this spot and finish the water well. First, whatever's down there has been waiting this long. It can wait a little longer." They moved the drilling operation 20 feet to the east and successfully completed the water well. The flow rate was everything Tom had promised: enough water to support not just Martha's basic needs, but potentially a much larger operation. But as they packed up the drilling equipment 3 days later, Martha couldn't stop thinking about what they had encountered at 182 feet. The geological surveys had mentioned mineral deposits, but nothing about large metal objects buried at that depth. "You know," Tom said as he prepared to leave, "I've been thinking about what we hit down there. The depth, the size, the way it felt when the drill bit struck it. That's not mining equipment. Mining gear from the 1920s would have been mostly wood and iron. This felt like steel, and a lot of it." "What are you suggesting?" Martha asked. "I'm not sure. But if I had to guess, I'd say someone buried something down there on purpose. They wanted to keep hidden." As Tom's truck disappeared down the dirt road, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still air, Martha stood beside her new well and considered her options. She now had abundant water, which solved her immediate survival needs and made the property genuinely valuable. She could sell it to a developer and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. The geological surveys, the buried documents, the evidence of extensive mining operations. Now this mysterious metal object, it all pointed to secrets that had been hidden for nearly a century. That night, Martha made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of playing it safe, instead of taking the smart path and selling the property, she decided to find out what was buried 182 feet beneath her land. She had no idea that this decision would lead to the discovery of a treasure vault that had been waiting almost 100 years to be found. She had no idea that Jeremiah Hendricks' sudden disappearance in 1923 was connected to one of the most audacious hiding places in American history. All she knew was that the desert was full of secrets, and she was finally in a position to uncover them. The water well had given her the resources to stay on the property indefinitely. Now it was time to find out what else was waiting beneath the Nevada sand. The stars were brilliant in the desert sky as Martha fell asleep that night, dreaming of hidden treasures and long-lost fortunes. Now, she had no way of knowing that her dreams were about to become reality in the most extraordinary way possible. Martha woke before dawn the next morning with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Robert's death. The successful water well had given her more than just a reliable water source. It had given her confidence, and more importantly, partner in Vincent Morales, who had both the resources and the interest to help her investigate the mysterious metal object they had encountered. She called Vincent at 7 a.m., knowing he was an early riser from their previous conversations. "Vincent, it's Martha. I've been thinking about what Tom's drill hit yesterday. I want to excavate that site." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Martha, that's a much bigger undertaking than drilling a well. We're talking about major excavation work, possibly dangerous depending on what's down there. And expensive." "I know," Martha replied. "But think about it. Someone buried something substantial at 182 feet. That's not casual disposal, that's deliberate concealment. I mean, based on everything I've learned about Jeremiah Hendricks, I think it's connected to his disappearance in 1923. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Martha could hear him breathing, considering the implications. "What are you proposing?" he finally asked. "You provide the funding for proper excavation equipment and expertise. I provide the land and the research. We split. Whatever we find, 50 to 50, and if we find nothing but an old mining boiler, then we both learn an expensive lesson about desert treasure hunting." Vincent chuckled. "You know what, Martha? I've made money on crazier gambles. Let me make some calls." By noon, Vincent had arranged for a small excavation crew to arrive the following Monday. The team would be led by a man named David Chen, an archaeologist and mining engineer who specialized in historical excavations. More importantly, Chen had experience with potentially dangerous underground work and the proper permits to conduct major excavations. The weekend gave Martha time to prepare. She spent hours reviewing the documents from Hendricks' buried box, looking for any clues about what might be hidden at the 182-foot depth. One detail that had initially seemed insignificant now took on new meaning. In a letter dated August 15th, 1923, just weeks before Hendricks' disappearance, he had written to his business partner in San Francisco, "The insurance matter we discussed is now complete. The policy is in the vault, as per your instructions. Should anything happen to me, the location details are with Morrison." Martha had initially assumed this referred to some kind of business insurance, but what if vault wasn't a metaphor? What if Hendricks had literally constructed a vault on the property? She tried to track down information about Morrison, but the name was too common and the trail too old. However, she did find records of Hendricks' business partner, a man named Charles Whitmore, who had been involved in several Nevada mining ventures. Whitmore had died in 1947, but his estate records were still available. The estate inventory made fascinating reading. Whitmore had died wealthy, with assets including several mining claims, real estate investments, and a substantial amount of gold and silver. But there was also a curious notation: safe deposit box contents, various documents and maps relating to Nevada mining operations. Beneficiary unable to locate corresponding assets. Martha felt her pulse quicken. Maps relating to Nevada mining operations that led to assets that were never found. The pieces were starting to fit together. Monday morning arrived with a convoy of vehicles that transformed Martha's quiet desert property into a bustling worksite. David Chen arrived with a team of 4 specialists, along with a truck-mounted excavator, ground-penetrating radar equipment, and enough safety gear to outfit a small army. Chen himself was a wiry man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years working in harsh conditions. He studied Martha's research materials with the focused attention of a professional, asking detailed questions about the timeline and her theories about what they might find. "Based on your research and the drilling data, I think we're looking at a deliberate burial," Chen told Martha as his team set up their equipment. "The depth suggests someone wanted to hide something permanently, and the size suggests it's substantial." The first step was mapping the underground structure using ground-penetrating radar. The results were startling. The metal object that had stopped Tom's drill was part of a much larger structure, a rectangular shape approximately 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet high, buried at a depth of 175 feet. "That's not mining equipment," Chen announced, studying the radar images. "That's a room. Someone built an underground chamber and then buried it." Martha felt a chill of excitement and fear. An underground room buried at 175 feet suggested planning, resources, and secrecy on a scale she hadn't imagined. The excavation began with careful mapping of the surface area directly above the buried structure. Chen's team worked methodically, photographing and documenting every step. This wasn't treasure hunting, it was archaeology, and Chen insisted on maintaining professional standards. The first day's work revealed the same pattern Martha had observed in her metal detector surveys. The soil contained numerous artifacts from the 1920s tools, equipment fragments, and personal items that painted a picture of extensive activity. But more importantly, The soil layers showed clear evidence of deliberate backfilling. Someone dug a massive hole here, Chen explained, pointing to the distinct layers visible in the excavation walls. This dark layer is topsoil that was moved aside. This lighter layer is subsoil. And this mixed layer is where they backfilled after placing whatever's down there. By the end of the first week, they had excavated down to 50 feet. The work was slow and careful, with each layer documented and analyzed. Martha found herself both fascinated and impatient with the methodical pace. The breakthrough came on the second Monday. At 165 feet, Chen's excavator hit something that rang like a bell. When struck, they had reached the top of the buried structure. "Everybody stop," Chen commanded. "From here on, we work by hand." The next phase of the excavation was painstaking. Using brushes, small tools, and careful techniques, Chen's team began exposing the top of the buried chamber. What they revealed was extraordinary. The structure was made of thick steel plates, professionally welded and designed to withstand enormous pressure. This wasn't a hastily constructed hiding place. It was an engineered vault, built to last centuries. "I've never seen anything like this," Chen admitted, running his hands over the steel surface. "The craftsmanship is incredible. Someone spent serious money building this thing." The vault's top was fitted with a heavy steel door, secured with what appeared to be a combination lock mechanism. The lock was corroded but still intact, suggesting the vault had never been opened since it was buried. Martha stared at the steel door, her heart pounding. After months of research, speculation, and excavation, she was looking at physical proof that Jeremiah Hendricks had indeed buried something extraordinary on her property. "Can we open it?" she asked. Chen examined the lock mechanism carefully. "Maybe. The combination lock is corroded, but the mechanism might still work. The bigger question is whether we should open it." "What do you mean?" "Well, legally, this could be complicated. If there's something valuable inside, there might be questions about ownership. And from a safety standpoint, we don't know what's in there. Could be anything from valuable artifacts to hazardous materials." Vincent, who had been watching the excavation with growing excitement, spoke up. "What's our legal position here, Martha? This is your property, right?" Martha had been researching this question for weeks. According to Nevada law, anything found on private property belongs to the property owner, with some exceptions for archaeological sites and hazardous materials. Since this appears to be a private cache rather than an archaeological site, I believe whatever's inside belongs to me. "And you're sure about the property boundaries?" "I've had the land surveyed twice. The vault is definitely on my property." Chen nodded slowly. "Okay, let's try to open it. But we do this carefully, and we document everything." The lock mechanism proved to be more sophisticated than it initially appeared. Despite the corrosion, Chen was able to determine that it required a 4-digit combination. The lock was also fitted with what appeared to be a backup mechanism, a series of small holes that suggested a secondary opening method. "This is high-end equipment for the 1920s, Chen observed. "Whoever built this vault spared no expense." Martha had been studying the documents from Hendricks' buried box, looking for any clues about possible combination numbers. She found several. Candidates: Hendricks' birth year 1881, the year he purchased the property 1919, and the year of his disappearance 1923. They tried 1881 first. The lock mechanism clicked but didn't open. 1919 produced no response at all. 1923 caused the lock to click several times, but still didn't open. "Wait," Martha said, remembering something from the documents. "Try 0923. September 1923, the month he disappeared." Chen carefully turned the combination dials. The lock clicked once, twice, 3 times, and then with a deep metallic thunk, it opened. The vault door was incredibly heavy, requiring all 4 team members to lift it. As it swung open, stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of metal and something else, something organic and old. Chen shone his flashlight into the vault, and the beam revealed an interior that took everyone's breath away. The vault was packed with wooden crates, metal containers, and what appeared to be furniture draped in canvas. The space was larger than the ground-penetrating radar had suggested, approximately 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet high. It was essentially an underground room, carefully organized and preserved. "My God," Vincent whispered. "It's like a time capsule." Chen's archaeological training kicked in. "Nobody goes inside until we've documented everything from the outside. We need photographs, measurements, and a complete inventory before we disturb anything." The documentation process took 2 days, using professional photography equipment and careful measurements. Chen's team created a complete record of the vault's contents as they had been found. The organization was meticulous. Someone had taken great care to preserve whatever was stored here. The wooden crates were labeled with numbers and dates. The metal containers were of various sizes, some small enough to hold by hand, others requiring 2 people to lift. The furniture under canvas appeared to be high-quality pieces, possibly antiques even by 1920 standards. But it was the papers that caught Martha's attention. Stacked on a wooden desk inside the vault were dozens of documents, maps, and what appeared to be financial records. Even from outside the vault, she could see that these were not random papers. They were organized, cataloged, and preserved with obvious care. When Chen finally gave permission to enter the vault, Martha was the first person inside. The space was dry and remarkably well preserved. The steel construction had protected everything from moisture, and the depth had maintained a constant temperature. The first crate she opened contained gold coins. Not just a few coins, but hundreds of them. Morgan silver dollars, gold eagles, and coins from various countries. The coins were packed in careful rows, each wrapped in oiled cloth. The second crate contained more coins, but these were different, older, rarer, and in pristine condition. Martha recognized some of them from her research into Nevada's mining history. These were the kind of coins that serious collectors paid enormous amounts for. Vincent opened a third crate and found currency paper money from various time periods. Some dating back to the Civil War, the bills were in remarkable condition, preserved by the dry air and careful storage. But it was the fourth crate that revealed the true scope of what they had found. Inside were precious stones, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires, both loose and set in jewelry. The jewelry alone represented a fortune, but the loose stones were even more valuable. "This isn't just a treasure cache," Chen observed, examining the meticulous organization. "This is a collection. Someone spent years, maybe decades, accumulating these items." Martha was studying the documents on the desk. What she found there explained everything and raised even more questions. The papers were a complete record of Jeremiah Hendricks' activities from 1919 to 1923, but he hadn't just been mining. He had been operating what appeared to be a sophisticated smuggling and money laundering operation. The documents showed that Hendricks had been purchasing valuable items from people who needed to convert assets quickly and secretly. During the economic chaos following World War I, wealthy individuals and businesses had needed to move money and valuables without attracting attention. Hendricks had provided that service. He had bought gold, jewelry, art, and other valuables at below-market prices from desperate sellers, then stored them in his underground vault while he waited for markets to stabilize. The Nevada mining operation had been his cover story. A legitimate business that explained his presence in the desert and his financial resources. But according to the documents, Hendricks had never intended to keep the valuables permanently. He had been planning to sell them gradually over many years to avoid attracting attention. The vault was his warehouse, his insurance policy against economic uncertainty. What had gone wrong? Why had he never returned to claim his fortune? The answer was in the final document on the desk, a letter dated September 20th, 1923, just days before Hendricks' disappearance. The letter was addressed to Charles Whitmore and marked urgent personal delivery only. Martha read the letter. Aloud to the team, "Charles, the situation has become untenable.
Ow.
Federal agents questioned Morrison yesterday about our San Francisco connections. He claims he told them nothing, but I cannot take the risk. I am leaving Nevada immediately and may not return for some time. The Nevada operation is suspended indefinitely. All assets are secure in the location we discussed. Should something happen to me, the vault location is marked on the survey map in your possession. Combination is the date of my departure. I have made arrangements to leave the country if necessary. Do not attempt to contact me through normal channels. If you do not hear from me within 6 months, assume the worst and act accordingly. The future of our enterprise depends on discretion and patience. The current political climate makes our activities extremely dangerous, but the assets are secure and will remain so indefinitely. Your partner, J. Hendricks, the letter explained. Everything. Hendricks hadn't been a victim of the desert or a casualty of failed mining ventures. He had been a sophisticated criminal who had fled the country when his operations came under federal investigation. But he had never returned to claim his treasure. Whether he had been caught, killed, or simply decided to start over somewhere else, the vault had remained sealed for nearly a century. Martha looked around the vault, trying to calculate the value of what they had found. The gold coins alone were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The jewelry and precious stones were worth even more. And the rare currency and collectibles could be worth millions to the right buyers. But there was more. In the back corner of the vault, covered by a heavy canvas tarp, were several large wooden crates that they hadn't opened yet. These crates were different from the others, heavier, more carefully constructed, and marked with symbols that Martha didn't recognize. Chen approached the largest crate with his typical caution. "These are built differently," he observed. "Look at the metal reinforcement. Someone really didn't want these damaged." When they opened the first large crate, everyone in the vault fell silent. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted wooden compartments, were artifacts that clearly belonged. In a museum, ancient pottery, sculptures, and what appeared to be pre-Columbian art pieces. "These aren't just valuable," Chen said quietly. "These are archaeological treasures. Some of these pieces could be thousands of years old." The second large crate contained similar artifacts. These appeared to be from different cultures: Asian art, African sculptures, and what looked like ancient Egyptian artifacts. "This is incredible," Vincent breathed. Hendricks wasn't just smuggling money and jewelry. He was dealing in stolen art and artifacts. Martha felt a chill as the implications became clear. They hadn't just discovered a treasure vault. They had uncovered evidence of what might be one of the largest art theft operations in American history. The third large crate contained documents that confirmed her fears. These were bills of sale, shipping manifests, and correspondence that detailed the purchase and transportation of stolen artifacts from around the world. Hendricks had been working with an international network of thieves and dealers, using his Nevada operation as a storage and distribution center. "This changes everything," Chen said solemnly. "If these artifacts were stolen, we can't just keep them. We have legal and ethical obligations." Martha felt her dreams of financial freedom slipping away. The treasure was worth more than she had ever imagined, but much of it couldn't legally be kept. "Oh, what do we do now?" she asked. Chen considered the question carefully. "The legitimate items, the gold coins, currency, and jewelry that Hendricks purchased legally, those belong to you. The artifacts, those need to be reported to the authorities. Many of them probably belong in museums or with their countries of origin." Vincent looked disappointed but nodded. "He's right, Martha. Can't keep stolen artifacts, no matter how valuable they are." But as they continued inventorying the vault's contents, Martha realized that the legitimate treasures alone represented a fortune. The gold coins, precious stones, and rare currency were worth well over $2 million by conservative estimates. Even after taxes and Vincent's share, she would have more money than she had ever dreamed of. More importantly, she had solved one of Nevada's most enduring mysteries. The disappearance of Jeremiah Hendricks was no longer a mystery. It was a story of greed, crime, and justice that had been waiting almost a century to be told. As the sun set over the Nevada desert that evening, Martha stood at the edge of the excavation site and looked down at the open vault. 3 months ago, she had been a broke widow facing foreclosure, desperate enough to spend her last $400 on worthless desert land. Now she was a millionaire, the owner of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Nevada history. and the person who had finally solved the mystery of Jeremiah Hendricks' treasure. The desert had indeed been full of secrets, and Martha Clearwater had been patient and determined enough to uncover them. Her $400 gamble had paid off beyond her wildest dreams, proving that sometimes the biggest risks really do lead to the most extraordinary rewards. But the story wasn't over yet. The vault contained more secrets, more questions, and more treasures than they had yet discovered. No, Martha was beginning to realize that finding the treasure was just the beginning of her adventure. The weeks following the vault discovery transformed Martha's life in ways she could never have anticipated. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive had become a complex web of legal proceedings. Media attention, archaeological investigations, and personal challenges that tested her in entirely new ways. The first challenge came within 48 hours of opening the vault. David Chen, true to his professional obligations, had contacted the FBI's art crime team to report the suspected stolen artifacts. By Thursday morning, Martha's remote desert property was crawling with federal agents, museum curators, and international art recovery specialists. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, a specialist in art theft recovery, took charge of the investigation. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had spent her career tracking stolen artifacts around the world. When she first met Martha, her expression was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Clearwater, I want to be clear about the situation," Agent Martinez explained as they stood beside the excavation site. "You're not in any legal trouble. You discovered this cache legally on your own property, and you reported it appropriately. However, we need to determine which items were legitimately acquired and which were stolen." The process was more complex than Martha had imagined. Each artifact had to be photographed, cataloged, and compared against international databases of stolen art. The FBI's art crime team worked alongside representatives from Interpol, UNESCO, and major museums from around the world. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, curator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, examined the ancient artifacts with obvious excitement. "Some of these pieces are extraordinary," she told Martha. "This pre-Columbian pottery is museum quality, and these Egyptian artifacts, if they're authentic, they're priceless." But authentication brought complications. Several pieces matched descriptions of artifacts that had disappeared from museums and private collections in the early 1920s. The investigation revealed that Hendricks' criminal network had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. He was essentially running an international art theft ring, Agent Martinez explained. "We're finding connections to thefts in Egypt, Greece, Mexico, and several European countries. Your discovery is helping us solve crimes that are nearly a century old." Meanwhile, the legitimate treasures remained in Martha's possession, but even these created challenges. The gold coins alone weighed over 200 pounds and required professional security. During transportation to appraisal experts, the jewelry needed evaluation by specialists in antique pieces, and the rare currency required consultation with numismatic experts. The appraisal process took 3 weeks and revealed values that exceeded even Martha's optimistic estimates. The gold coins were worth $1.7 million at current gold prices. But their numismatic value added another $800,000. The jewelry, much of it from the Art Deco period, was appraised at $1.2 million. The rare currency, including several bills that were among the finest examples known to exist, was valued at $900,000. "Your total legitimate treasure is worth approximately $4.6 million, announced Harold Whitman, the lead appraiser from Christie's auction house. That's before considering any historical premiums for the story behind the discovery. Vincent, who had been remarkably patient throughout the legal proceedings, finally smiled when he heard the numbers. "Well, Martha, looks like our partnership worked out pretty well, but the money, while life-changing, was only part of Martha's transformation." The discovery had attracted international media attention, and Martha found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought. The first interview request came from the local Reno newspaper, followed quickly by calls from national news networks. CNN, NBC, and the Discovery Channel all wanted to tell Martha's story. The narrative was irresistible. A broke widow who spent her last $400 on desert land and discovered a multi-million-dollar treasure vault. Martha initially resisted the media attention. She was a private person who had never enjoyed being the center of attention. But her lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, whom Vincent had recommended, convinced her that controlling her story was important. "If you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you," Rebecca advised, "and they might not get it right." Martha's first television interview was with 60 Minutes. The veteran correspondent, Bill Hartman, came to Nevada to interview her on the property where everything had happened. Standing beside the now famous excavation site, Martha told her story with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. "When I bought this land, I was desperate," Martha explained to the camera. "I'd lost my husband, faced foreclosure, and was down to my last few $100s. Buying 160 acres of desert for $400 seemed crazy to everyone, including myself sometimes. But desperation can make you brave." The interview aired 3 weeks later and transformed Martha into a minor celebrity overnight. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear about the desert treasure widow, who had turned $400 into millions through determination and luck. But fame brought unexpected complications. Martha's phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deal, offers, and movie proposals. Publishers wanted her to write a memoir. Documentary filmmakers wanted to option her story. Treasure hunters began arriving at her property, convinced there were more undiscovered caches hidden in the Nevada desert. More troubling were the legal challenges. 3 different parties filed claims against Martha's treasure, arguing they had rights to portions of the discovery. The first claim came from distant relatives of Jeremiah Hendricks, who argued that the treasure should be considered part of his estate. The second came from a group of investors who claimed they held mineral rights to the property, dating back to the 1940s. The third, most seriously, came from the state of Nevada, which argued that the treasure should be considered a state archaeological find. Rebecca Torres proved her worth during these legal battles. She systematically dismantled each claim, demonstrating that Martha's rights to the treasure were legally sound. The Hendricks relatives had no standing because Jeremiah Hendricks had been engaged in criminal activity when he buried the treasure. The mineral rights claim was invalid because the treasure consisted of manufactured goods, not naturally occurring minerals. And the state's archaeological claim failed because the vault was clearly a private cache rather than a historical site with public significance. Mrs. Clearwater discovered this treasure through legal means on property she legally owns. Rebecca argued in court. The fact that the discovery is extraordinary doesn't change the fundamental legal principles involved. The legal battles took 6 months to resolve, but Martha ultimately retained full ownership of her legitimate treasures. However, the stress of the proceedings, combined with the constant media attention, began to take its toll.
Ow.
I started to wonder if finding the treasure was worth all the complications it brought, Martha later reflected. I'd gone from having no money and complete privacy to having millions of dollars and no privacy at all. The turning point came when Martha received a letter from a young woman named Lisa Chen, no relation to David Chen, the archaeologist. Lisa was a graduate student in art history who had been following Martha's story and had a proposal that would change everything. "Dear Mrs. Clearwater," the letter began, "I've been inspired by your story and have a suggestion that might interest you. Instead of simply selling your treasure and retiring, have you considered using your discovery to create something lasting and meaningful?" Lisa's proposal was ambitious. Use Martha's treasure discovery as the foundation for a museum and research center dedicated to Nevada's mining history and the broader story of the American West. The facility would display both Martha's treasures and the recovered stolen artifacts, once their legal status was resolved, creating a world-class destination that would preserve the story for future generations. "Your discovery isn't just about the money," Lisa wrote. "It's about history, determination, the stories that shaped the American West. You have an opportunity to ensure these stories are preserved and shared." The idea intrigued Martha, but she needed to understand the practical implications. She invited Lisa to visit the property, and the young woman's enthusiasm was infectious. "Imagine a world-class museum right here," Lisa said, gesturing across the desert landscape. Visitors could see the actual vault, learn about Jeremiah Hendricks' operation, and understand the broader context of Nevada's mining history. You could create jobs, boost the local economy, and ensure your story has lasting impact. Martha spent weeks considering the proposal. The museum would require substantial investment, millions of dollars for construction, staffing, and operations. But she had the resources now, and more importantly, she had a purpose that extended beyond personal financial security. Vincent supported the museum idea enthusiastically. "You've already made enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life," he pointed out. "Now you have a chance to create something that will outlast both of us." The decision to proceed with the museum project marked the beginning of Martha's transformation from treasure hunter to cultural preservationist. She established the Clearwater Foundation for Western Heritage, with Lisa Chen as the founding director and a mission to preserve and share the stories of the American West. The museum project attracted support from unexpected quarters. The Nevada state government, which had initially fought Martha's ownership of the treasure, now supported the museum as an economic development opportunity. Federal agencies offered assistance with archaeological expertise and artifact preservation. Private donors, inspired by Martha's story, contributed both funding and artifacts to the collection. Construction began in the spring, exactly 1 year after Martha had first purchased the property. The museum was designed to blend with the desert landscape while providing state-of-the-art facilities for displaying and preserving artifacts. The centerpiece was the original vault, carefully preserved and displayed exactly as it had been found. But the museum was more than just a repository for Martha's treasure. It became a comprehensive exploration of Nevada's mining history, featuring exhibits on the silver boom, the gold rushes, and the countless individual stories of people who had sought their fortunes in the Nevada desert. The stolen artifacts presented a special challenge and opportunity. Working with international authorities, Martha and the museum developed a unique program for displaying recovered stolen art. Pieces were exhibited with full information about their theft and recovery, creating educational opportunities about art, crime, and cultural preservation. "We're not just showing beautiful objects," explained Dr. Reeves, who had joined the museum as curator of ancient artifacts. "We're telling the story of how these pieces were stolen, how they were recovered, and why protecting cultural heritage matters." The museum's opening, scheduled for the 2nd anniversary of Martha's treasure discovery, attracted visitors from around the world. The governor of Nevada spoke at the dedication ceremony, praising Martha's vision and generosity. Representatives from several countries thanked her for her role in recovering their stolen cultural artifacts. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Martha's daughter Jessica spoke at the ceremony. Jessica, who had been so critical of her mother's crazy decision to buy desert land, now stood before hundreds of visitors to praise Martha's courage and vision. 2 years ago, I thought my mother had lost her mind, Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. She was grieving, nearly broke, and making decisions that seemed completely irrational. But she saw something that the rest of us missed. She saw a possibility where others saw only empty desert. The museum's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months of opening, it was attracting over 100,000 visitors annually. The economic impact on the surrounding communities was substantial, creating jobs and bringing tourism dollars to a region that had struggled economically for decades. Martha found herself transformed from a broke widow into a respected cultural institution leader. She traveled to conferences on museum management, spoke at universities about determination and risk-taking, and consulted with other communities interested in preserving their local history. But perhaps the most significant transformation was personal. The woman who had sat in her car outside the courthouse 2 years earlier, desperate and uncertain, had become confident, purposeful, and influential. She had discovered not just monetary treasure, but a sense of mission that gave her life new meaning. The money was important, Martha reflected during an interview on the museum's 1st anniversary. It gave me security and options I'd never had before, but the real treasure was discovering what I was capable of when I stopped playing it safe. The museum also served as a platform for Martha to support other women facing similar challenges. She established a scholarship program for widows returning to school, funded a support group for women facing financial hardship, and spoke regularly about the importance of taking calculated risks when facing desperate situations. I'm not advocating that everyone should spend their last $400 on desert land, Martha would say with a smile. But I am saying that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. The Hendricks mystery, meanwhile, continued to yield new discoveries. Researchers using Martha's find as a starting point uncovered evidence of Hendricks' international network and archives around the world. The story expanded far beyond Nevada, revealing connections to art thefts in Paris, archaeological looting in Egypt, and smuggling operations that spanned 3 continents. Most intriguingly, researchers found evidence suggesting that Hendricks had not died in 1923, as most had assumed. Bank records discovered in Swiss archives suggested someone matching his description had been making withdrawals from accounts connected to his operation as late as 1947. The mystery of what had ultimately happened to Jeremiah Hendricks remained unsolved, adding another layer of intrigue to the museum's exhibits. As Martha stood in her museum 3 years after buying the property, surrounded by artifacts that told the story of her incredible journey, she marveled at how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once worried about affording groceries now oversaw a multi-million-dollar institution. The widow who had felt powerless and adrift now provided inspiration and support to others facing their own challenges. The desert wind still whispered across the Nevada landscape, carrying secrets and stories from the past. But now it also carried the voices of thousands of visitors who came to learn about courage, determination, and the extraordinary things that can happen when ordinary people refuse to give up. Martha's $400 investment had indeed paid off beyond her wildest dreams. But the real return had been the discovery that even in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, the potential for transformation and renewal remains. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to dig deeper and patient enough to uncover the treasures that lie hidden beneath the surface. The story of the Desert Treasure Widow had become more than just a tale of luck and perseverance. It had become proof that the American dream of reinvention and opportunity was still alive, waiting for those bold enough to pursue it in the most unlikely places. 5 years after Martha Clearwater spent her last $400 on what everyone called worthless desert land, she stood before a gathering of international dignitaries, museum directors, and treasure hunters at the 5th Annual Western Heritage Symposium. The event, hosted at her museum, it's become one of the most prestigious gatherings in the field of historical preservation and archaeological discovery. But this year's symposium would be different. Martha had promised to reveal new discoveries that would finally complete the Jeremiah Hendricks story, discoveries that had taken 5 years of careful investigation to verify, and even longer to understand their full implications. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martha began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to command respect through both fortune and wisdom. "When I first bought this land, I thought I was gambling my last dollars on a desperate hope. I had no idea I was about to uncover one of the most significant treasure stories in American history. But more importantly, I had no idea that the real treasure wasn't what Jeremiah Hendricks buried in 1923. It was what he left behind as clues to something far more extraordinary." The audience leaned forward. Over the years, Martha had become known for her careful, methodical approach to revealing new information. She never made claims she couldn't substantiate, and she never oversold her discoveries. When Martha Clearwater promised revelations, the archaeological community listened. 3 months ago, our research team made a discovery that has taken us 5 years to properly investigate and authenticate. We found Jeremiah Hendricks' final cache, not here in Nevada, but in a location that explains everything about his disappearance and reveals the true scope of his operations.
Dr. James
Morrison, a historian from Stanford University who had become the museum's chief researcher, stepped forward to present the findings. Over the past 5 years, Morrison had become obsessed with solving the Hendricks mystery, following leads that took him from Swiss banks to Mexican archives to private collections around the world. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Morrison explained. A death notice in a 1952 Mexican newspaper that mentioned an American expatriate named Geronimo Hernandez who had died in Guadalajara. The notice was brief, but it mentioned that the deceased had been a prominent businessman who had preserved important cultural artifacts for future generations. The description was vague enough that it might have been coincidental. But Morrison had learned to follow even the smallest leads. When he traveled to Guadalajara to investigate, he discovered that Geronimo Hernandez had indeed been Jeremiah Hendricks. Living under an assumed identity for nearly 30 years, Hendricks didn't die in 1923, Morrison continued. He successfully fled to Mexico, where he lived quietly but comfortably until his death in 1952. But here's the extraordinary part: he spent those 30 years not as a criminal in hiding, but as a legitimate collector and preservationist. The story that emerged from Morrison's research was more complex and ultimately more redemptive than anyone had imagined. Hendricks had indeed fled Nevada. In 1923, when federal investigators got too close to his smuggling operation, but his escape to Mexico had triggered a profound change in his character and priorities. Using contacts he had developed through his smuggling network, Hendricks had established himself in Guadalajara as a dealer in legitimate antiquities. More importantly, he had used his knowledge of the international art theft trade to help Mexican authorities recover stolen artifacts and return them to their proper places. We found records showing that Hendricks worked quietly with the Mexican government for nearly 3 decades, Morrison explained. He helped them track down and recover hundreds of pre-Columbian artifacts that had been stolen and smuggled out of the country. In many cases, he used his own money to purchase stolen items and return them to Mexican museums. But the most extraordinary discovery was yet to come. In 1951, just months before his death, Hendricks had created a final treasure cache, not for his own benefit, but as a gift to future generations. Hendricks had come to believe that his criminal past gave him a responsibility to preserve and protect cultural artifacts. Morrison continued. In his final cache, he collected some of the most significant pieces he had encountered during his 30 years in Mexico. Pieces that he had either purchased legitimately or helped recover from thieves. The location of this final cache had been described in a letter Hendricks had left with his Mexican lawyer to be opened only after his death. The letter had remained sealed in the lawyer's files for decades until Morrison's investigation finally tracked it down. Martha stepped forward again to continue the story. The final cache was located in a cave system in the mountains outside Guadalajara. With the full cooperation of the Mexican government, we mounted an expedition to investigate Hendricks' final hiding place. The expedition, conducted just 6 months earlier, had required extensive permits, archaeological oversight, and international cooperation. Martha had funded the entire operation, working with Mexican authorities and UNESCO to ensure that any discoveries would be handled appropriately. What they found in the mountain cave exceeded everyone's expectations. Hendricks had created not just a treasure cache, but a carefully curated collection that told the story of Mexico's rich cultural heritage. The cave contained over 300 artifacts, Martha explained, ranging from ancient Mayan sculptures to colonial lyra, religious art, but these weren't stolen pieces. They were items that Hendricks had spent decades collecting legally, with full documentation and provenance. More importantly, Hendricks had left detailed records explaining the significance of each piece and his reasons for preserving them. The collection represented his attempt to create a comprehensive archive of Mexican cultural artifacts that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed. But the real treasure, Martha continued, is what these discoveries taught us about redemption, responsibility, and the power of transformation. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Martha's story had evolved from a simple treasure tale into something much more profound, a meditation on human nature, the possibility of change, and the responsibility that comes with great discovery. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to David Chen or Lisa Chen, a psychologist who had studied Martha's story as part of her research into post-traumatic growth, had joined the museum's advisory board. She spoke next about the psychological dimensions of Martha's journey. Martha's story illustrates something we call post-traumatic growth, Dr. Chen explained. When people face severe challenges like the loss of a spouse and financial ruin, they sometimes discover capabilities and strengths they never knew they possessed. Martha didn't just survive her crisis. She transformed it into an opportunity for extraordinary personal growth. But the symposium's most moving moment came when Martha introduced a special guest, her daughter Jessica. Now, Dr. Jessica Clearwater Martinez, who had earned a PhD in archaeology and had joined the museum's research team. When my mother bought this land 5 years ago, I thought she was having a breakdown, Jessica admitted to the audience. I was so focused on the financial risk that I couldn't see what she could see, the potential for something extraordinary. Jessica had spent the past 2 years working on a comprehensive study of women who had made dramatic life changes after experiencing major losses. Her research, funded by the Clearwater Foundation, was revealing patterns that challenged conventional assumptions about risk, age, and capability. What we're learning is that my mother's story isn't as unusual as we thought, Jessica explained. When women face severe challenges later in life, they often discover a capacity for bold action that surprises everyone, including themselves. The key factors seem to be necessity, determination, and the willingness to ignore conventional wisdom about what's appropriate for their age and circumstances. The research had practical implications beyond academic interest. Jessica's work was being used to develop programs that helped widows and other women facing major life transitions to identify and pursue opportunities for reinvention. But the day's biggest surprise came in Martha's closing remarks. After 5 years of incredible success, she was announcing a new chapter in her own story. The museum will continue to operate and grow, Martha assured the audience. But I've decided it's time for me to step back from day-to-day operations and pursue a new challenge. The new challenge was ambitious, even by Martha's standards. She was launching an international foundation dedicated to helping people in desperate circumstances identify and pursue unconventional opportunities for transformation. I've learned that my story isn't unique, Martha explained. Around the world are people facing seemingly impossible situations who have the potential for extraordinary transformation if they can just find the courage to take calculated risks. The Martha Clearwater Foundation for Second Chances would provide both financial support and practical guidance for people attempting dramatic life changes. The foundation would focus particularly on women over 50, a demographic that conventional institutions often overlooked despite their potential. For significant contributions, I spent 52 years playing by the rules, doing what was expected, and avoiding unnecessary risks, Martha reflected. It took losing everything to discover what I was really capable of. I want to help other people make that discovery without having to wait for a crisis to force their hand. The foundation's first project was already underway, a partnership with microfinance organizations to provide small loans and business training for women starting enterprises in unconventional fields or locations. The goal was to replicate, on a smaller scale, the kind of dramatic transformation that Martha had experienced. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Martha's new venture was its philosophical foundation. She had come to believe that society systematically underestimated the potential of people facing severe challenges, particularly older women. When people told me I was crazy to buy desert land with my last $400, they weren't being cruel, Martha explained. They were reflecting conventional wisdom about appropriate behavior for a 52-year-old widow. But conventional wisdom is often wrong, especially when it comes to human potential. The symposium concluded with the unveiling of the museum's latest exhibit, a comprehensive display that told the complete Jeremiah Hendricks story. From his criminal beginnings through his transformation in Mexico to his final acts of cultural preservation. The exhibit didn't glorify Hendricks' criminal activities, but it didn't condemn him either. Instead, it presented his life as a complex story of moral evolution, showing how someone who had started as a sophisticated criminal had ultimately become a force for cultural preservation and historical justice. Hendricks' story reminds us that people are capable of profound change, Martha noted. He spent the last 30 years of his life trying to make amends for his earlier crimes. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it shows that redemption is possible even for people who have made serious mistakes. The exhibit also included a detailed account of Martha's own journey, from desperate widow to successful museum director to international philanthropist. But the display emphasized that her transformation was ongoing, that she continued to take risks, pursue new challenges, and expand her understanding of what was possible. The real treasure, the exhibit's concluding panel read, isn't the golden jewels that Jeremiah Hendricks buried in the Nevada desert. It's the discovery that human beings are capable of extraordinary transformation when they have the courage to pursue unlikely opportunities and the determination to persist. Through inevitable challenges, as the symposium ended and visitors began to leave, Martha walked alone to the original excavation site where her incredible journey had begun. The vault was still there, now protected by a climate-controlled enclosure that allowed visitors to see exactly where the treasure had been discovered. Standing beside the vault, Martha reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a broken woman with no future and no hope. Today, she was launching an international foundation. Her daughter had followed her into archaeology, and her story was inspiring people around the world to reconsider what was possible in their own lives. The transformation hadn't been easy. Along the way, she had faced legal challenges, media scrutiny, family criticism, and constant pressure to play it safe. But each challenge had strengthened her conviction that the biggest risk in life was not taking any risks at all. To think that security came from having enough money and avoiding unnecessary complications, Martha mused to herself. Now I understand that real security comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you, and that the only way to develop that confidence is to face challenges that seem impossible. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly around her, seemingly barren but full of hidden possibilities. In the distance, she could see the lights of her museum, where thousands of visitors came each year to learn about courage, determination, and the extraordinary things that could happen when ordinary people refused to accept limitations. But Martha was already looking beyond the museum, beyond even her new foundation, to challenges and opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. At 57, she had learned that life's most significant adventures often began just when conventional wisdom suggested they should be ending. The wind whispered across the desert, carrying stories of all the people who had come to this harsh land seeking their fortunes. Most had failed, broken by the unforgiving environment and the enormous challenges of extracting wealth from such an uncompromising place. But some, like Martha, had discovered that the real treasure wasn't what you could take from the desert. It was what the desert could teach you about yourself. In facing the ultimate test of survival and determination, they had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. As the stars appeared in the clear Nevada sky, Martha made a silent promise to herself and to all the people who would benefit from her foundation. She would continue taking calculated risks, pursuing unlikely opportunities, and refusing to accept conventional limitations on what was possible. The broke widow who had gambled her last $400 on worthless desert land was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that the greatest treasures in life were often buried beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deeper and persistent enough to keep searching even when everyone else had given up. Martha's story had become proof that the American dream of reinvention and opportunity was still alive for those bold enough to pursue it. But more than that, it had become evidence of something even more fundamental: the incredible capacity of human beings to transform themselves when they have the courage to embrace uncertainty and the wisdom to see possibility where others see only problems. The desert had indeed been full of secrets, and Martha Clearwater had been patient and determined enough to uncover them all. But the greatest secret she had discovered was the one within herself, the knowledge that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, and it's never too risky to pursue the life you were meant to live. As she walked back toward her museum, Martha smiled at the thought of all the adventures still waiting to be discovered. The treasure vault had been just the beginning. The real journey was everything that came after, the ongoing adventure of a life lived without limits, pursued with courage, dedicated to helping others discover their own extraordinary potential. The story of the desert treasure widow was complete, but the legacy would continue forever in the lives of all the people who would be inspired to take their own calculated risks and pursue their own impossible dreams. And that, Martha realized, was the most valuable treasure of all. 10 years had passed since Martha Clearwater first stood on the courthouse steps in Reno, clutching that crumpled newspaper clipping about foreclosure auctions. Now, as she prepared for what she had announced would be her final public appearance at the 10th anniversary celebration of the Clearwater Museum for Western Heritage, reflected on how one desperate decision had created ripples that continued to spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. The transformation of her desert property was breathtaking. What had once been 160 acres of seemingly barren land now hosted the most visited museum complex in Nevada. The original museum building had expanded into a sprawling campus that included research facilities, educational centers, artifact restoration labs, and even a small hotel for visiting scholars. The museum grounds were packed with visitors from around the world, over 300,000 annually, making it one of Nevada's top tourist destinations. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of Martha's impact was in the individual, lives that had been transformed by her example. As she stood at the podium overlooking the crowd, Martha could see faces that represented stories she had come to know intimately over the years. In the front row sat Maria Santos, a 58-year-old former factory worker from Detroit, who had used a $5,000 microloan from the Martha Clearwater Foundation to start what had become a multi-million-dollar urban farming business. Her company now employed over 200 people and had transformed food deserts in 3 major cities. Next to her was Dr. Patricia Williams, a 62-year-old former high school teacher who had earned her Ph.D. in archaeology at age 65 and now led internationally recognized expeditions in Central America. Behind them sat Chen Wei, 54-year-old former software engineer who had lost his job during a tech industry downsizing and had used foundation support to start a nonprofit that taught coding skills to seniors. His organization had trained over 10,000 older adults in technology skills, proving that age was no barrier to adapting to the digital economy. But perhaps the most meaningful face in the crowd belonged to her own granddaughter, 8-year-old Emma Martinez, Jessica's daughter. Emma had grown up hearing stories about her grandmother's adventures and had already announced her intention to become a treasure hunter scientist when she grew up. She sat with rapt attention, her young mind already absorbing lessons about courage, persistence, and the power of refusing to accept limitations. 10 years ago, Martha began, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. I made a decision that everyone said was crazy. I spent my last $400 on land that nobody wanted, in a place where nobody lived, chasing a dream that nobody believed in. Today, I want to tell you what I've learned about the real treasures that can be found when we stop accepting other people's definitions of what's possible. The speech Martha was about to give had been months in the making. It would be her final major public address, marking not just the museum's anniversary but her transition to a quieter phase of life. At 62, she had accomplished more than most people achieve in several lifetimes, but she wasn't stepping away out of exhaustion or a sense of completion. She was stepping away because she had learned one more crucial lesson about leadership, knowing when to let others carry the torch forward, while you step back to nurture the next generation of changemakers. The greatest discovery I made wasn't Jeremiah Hendrick's fault, Martha continued, her voice gaining strength and passion. It wasn't the gold coins or the artifacts or even the historical significance of what we found. The greatest discovery was learning that the stories we tell ourselves about what's possible are usually far too small, and the limitations we accept are almost always self-imposed. Over the past decade, the Martha Clearwater Foundation for Second Chances had become a global phenomenon. The foundation had funded over 15,000 microloans and business ventures in 47 countries, with a success rate that had stunned even its most optimistic supporters. Nearly 83% of funded ventures were still operating successfully after 5 years, a rate that traditional venture capital firms could only dream of achieving. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the foundation's current director and a former Harvard business school professor, had spent 3 years studying the foundation's unprecedented success rate. Her research had identified patterns that were revolutionizing how economists and social scientists thought about risk, age, and entrepreneurship. What Martha's foundation has proven, Dr. Rodriguez had written in a landmark Harvard Business Review article that had been cited over 500 times, is that people over 50 who have experienced significant life challenges often make exceptionally successful entrepreneurs. They combine hard-earned life experience with a willingness to take calculated risks that younger people often lack. More importantly, they're motivated by purpose rather than just profit, which leads to more sustainable and socially beneficial business models. The foundation's work had influenced government policy in 23 countries. The Clearwater model of supporting late-life entrepreneurship had been adopted by organizations, ranging from the World Bank to local community development agencies. Martha's $400 gamble had become the foundation for a global movement that was changing how societies viewed aging, potential, and economic development. The European Union had created a €50 million fund based on the Clearwater model. Japan had established similar programs to address its aging population and economic stagnation. Even developing countries had found that supporting older entrepreneurs was often more effective than traditional youth-focused development programs. But the ripple effects extended far beyond formal programs and policies. Martha's story had inspired countless individuals to reconsider their own assumptions about age, risk, and possibility. The museum's visitor logs were filled with notes from people who had been inspired to make dramatic changes in their own lives after hearing Martha's story. One letter that had arrived just the week before the anniversary. Celebration came from a 55-year-old accountant named Robert Chen, Mrs. Clearwater. I lost my job 6 months ago and thought my career was over. I'm 55, overqualified for most positions, and underqualified for the jobs that interest me. Then I visited your museum and realized that maybe this wasn't actually the end of my story. Maybe it was the beginning of the story I was meant to tell. I'm writing to tell you that I just signed my first major contract for the custom woodworking business I'd dreamed about for 20 years but never had the courage to pursue. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Stories like Robert's arrived at the museum almost daily. There was the 67-year-old grandmother who had started a successful adventure travel company specifically for seniors. The 59-year-old former corporate executive who had become a celebrated chef after attending culinary school, and the 61-year-old retired nurse who had launched a meditation app that now had over 2 million users worldwide. But here's what I want you to understand. Martha continued her speech, her voice growing more passionate as she reached the heart of her message. I'm not special. I'm not uniquely brave or talented or lucky. I'm just someone who is desperate. Enough to ignore the voice that says people like you don't do things like this. I'm someone who learned that the biggest risk in life isn't taking chances, it's refusing to take them. And if I can do it, anyone can do it, the audience included. Several people whose stories had become part of the museum's ongoing exhibits. Margaret Thompson, now 77, had started her adventure travel company at 67 and had just returned from leading a group of seniors on a trek through Nepal. James Kim had not only become a successful chef, but had opened 3 restaurants and written 2 best-selling cookbooks about starting over in midlife. Each of these stories shared common elements, a significant life disruption that shattered conventional plans, a moment of desperate decision-making that forced them outside their comfort zones, and the courage to pursue an unconventional path, despite widespread skepticism from family and friends. The museum had begun documenting these stories as part of an ambitious research project on late-life transformation that was being conducted in partnership with universities around the world. Dr. Lisa Chen, now the museum's chief curator, and a recognized expert on transformational narratives, had overseen the development of the second act exhibit. This comprehensive display featured the detailed stories of over 300 people who had made dramatic life changes after age 50. The exhibit had become one of the museum's most popular features, inspiring visitors to reconsider their own potential for transformation. What we're learning through our research, Dr. Chen explained to the anniversary crowd, is that Martha's story represents a broader human capacity that society has consistently undervalued and misunderstood. People in their 50s, 60s, and beyond often have optimal conditions for entrepreneurship and creative risk-taking. They have experience, perspective, financial flexibility, and often the emotional freedom to pursue meaningful work rather than merely lucrative employment. The research had profound practical implications. 17 universities had established programs specifically designed for older entrepreneurs. Investment firms had created funds focused exclusively on businesses started by people over 50. Governments had begun to recognize the enormous economic potential of supporting late-life career transitions, particularly as populations aged and traditional retirement models became economically unsustainable. But perhaps the most significant development was cultural. Martha's story had become part of a broader shift in how society viewed aging and potential. The narrative of decline and limitation that had traditionally defined later life was being replaced by stories of possibility, growth, and transformation. "I want to share something deeply personal with you," Martha continued, her voice softening as she reached a more intimate part of her speech. "When I first found that treasure vault, I thought I had solved all my problems. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had security that I'd never experienced before, and I had the respect and admiration of people around the world. But I quickly learned that external treasure is meaningless without internal treasure. The deep knowledge that you are capable of extraordinary things, that your potential has no expiration date, and that your greatest contributions might still lie ahead of you." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Martha had become a masterful public speaker over the years, but this speech felt different, more intimate, more vulnerable, more final. She was sharing not just her story, but the deepest wisdom she had gained from her incredible journey. The real treasure isn't the gold or the artifacts. Martha's story had become part of a broader shift in how society viewed aging and potential. The narrative of decline and limitation that had traditionally defined later life was being replaced by stories of possibility, growth, and transformation. "I want to share something deeply personal with you," Martha continued, her voice softening as she reached a more intimate part of her speech. "When I first found that treasure vault, I thought I had solved all my problems. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had security that I'd never experienced before, and I had the respect and admiration of people around the world. But I quickly learned that external treasure is meaningless without internal treasure. The deep knowledge that you are capable of extraordinary things, that your potential has no expiration date, and that your greatest contributions might still lie ahead of you." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Martha had become a masterful public speaker over the years, but this speech felt different, more intimate, more vulnerable, more final. She was sharing not just her story, but the deepest wisdom she had gained from her incredible journey. "The real treasure isn't the gold or the artifacts or even the museum we've built together. The real treasure is the discovery that every single person, regardless of their age, their circumstances, their past failures, or their current limitations, has the capacity for profound transformation. The only question is whether you have the courage to dig for it, the persistence to keep digging when others tell you to stop, and the vision to see possibilities where others see only problems." Martha's granddaughter, Emma, was sitting in the front row, her 8-year-old eyes wide with attention and understanding that seemed beyond her years. Martha had been teaching Emma about the importance of courage, persistence, and helping others, hoping to pass on the lessons she had learned through her own transformation. "Emma," Martha said, addressing her granddaughter directly while speaking to everyone in the audience, "someday when you're older, people might tell you that your dreams are too big, or that you're too old or too young or too inexperienced to achieve them. When that happens, I want you to remember this day, and remember that your grandmother was once a broke widow who everyone said was making terrible decisions. And she built all of this because she refused to accept other people's limitations as her own reality." The crowd erupted in sustained applause, but Martha held up her hand for quiet. She had one more story to tell, perhaps the most important one of all. "6 months ago, I received a letter that brought my entire journey full circle," Martha continued, her voice filled with emotion. "It was from a woman named Sarah Hendricks Morrison, the great-granddaughter of Jeremiah Hendricks. She had been following our story and our research into her ancestor's life for years, as she wanted to share something that had been passed down through her family for nearly a century. The letter had contained information that completed the final piece of the Jeremiah Hendricks puzzle. Sarah Hendricks Morrison had revealed that her family had always known the truth about Jeremiah's disappearance and his subsequent transformation in Mexico. More importantly, they had preserved letters he had written near the end of his life, expressing his deepest regrets about his criminal past and his hope that his story might someday inspire others to seek redemption for their mistakes. In his final letter, written just months before his death in 1952, Martha read from a copy she had brought to the podium. Jeremiah Hendricks wrote these words: "I have spent 30 years trying to atone for the crimes and mistakes of my youth. I have learned that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of change. But I have also learned that the greatest treasure is not what you can accumulate for yourself, but what you can give back to the world. I hope that someday someone will discover my story and understand that no one is beyond redemption, that no situation is beyond hope, and that it is never too late to become who you were meant to be. The treasures I have hidden are not my true legacy. My legacy is the proof that people can change, that mistakes can be corrected, and that every ending can become a new beginning." The parallels between Hendricks' story and Martha's were unmistakable and profound. Both had faced desperate situations that forced them to take extreme risks. Both had discovered that their greatest challenges became their greatest opportunities for growth. And both had learned that true wealth came not from what you could accumulate, but from what you could contribute to the betterment of others. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Jeremiah Hendricks Redemption Fund. Martha continued, her voice growing stronger with purpose. This new program will provide comprehensive support specifically for people who have made serious mistakes and are seeking to rebuild their lives in positive ways. Because if my story has taught me anything, it's that everyone deserves a second chance. And some of our greatest contributions to society come from people who have learned from their deepest failures and mistakes. The fund would be administered jointly by the museum and the foundation, providing not just financial support but comprehensive mentorship, education, and community support for people attempting to transform their lives after experiencing major setbacks. The program would focus particularly on formerly incarcerated individuals, people recovering from addiction, those who had experienced bankruptcy or business failures, and others who faced systematic barriers to conventional opportunities. Jeremiah Hendricks spent 30 years of his life proving that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that past mistakes don't have to define future possibilities, Martha explained. I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that society can change too, that we can become better at recognizing hidden potential, supporting genuine transformation, and believing in the power of second chances. As Martha prepared to conclude her speech, she announced that she would be stepping back from public life to focus on writing and mentoring the next generation of leaders. Her memoir, The $400 Gamble, a story of loss, risk, and redemption, would be published the following year, with all proceeds going to support the Foundation's expanding programs around the world. But this isn't goodbye, Martha assured the crowd, her voice filled with both gratitude and excitement for what lay ahead. This is just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The museum will continue to grow and evolve under Lisa's brilliant leadership. The Foundation will continue to support people seeking transformation under Amanda's expert direction. And the story will continue to inspire new adventures, new discoveries, and new transformations that none of us can yet imagine. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began to disperse into the desert evening, Martha walked one final time to the original excavation site. The vault was still there, now a centerpiece of the museum's outdoor exhibits, protected by a climate-controlled glass enclosure that allowed visitors to see exactly where her incredible journey had begun. Standing beside the vault where her transformation had started, Martha reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had not only changed her own life, but had created ripples as the brilliant desert stars appeared in the clear sky above. And Martha made one final promise to herself and to all the people who would continue to be inspired by her story long after she was gone. The greatest treasure wasn't what had been buried. In Jeremiah Hendrick's vault, it was the ongoing discovery that human potential has no expiration date, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be, and that the most valuable legacy anyone can leave is proof that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to pursue it. The broke widow who had gambled everything on a desperate hope had created something that would outlast any fortune. The eternal knowledge that every ending can become a beginning, every setback can become a setup for something extraordinary, and every person carries within themselves the capacity for incredible transformation that can change not just their own life, the lives of countless others. Martha's story had become living proof that the greatest treasures in life aren't found in vaults buried in the desert. They're discovered within ourselves, and we have the courage to dig deeper than anyone thinks is reasonable, persist longer than anyone thinks is practical, and believe bigger than anyone thinks is possible. And that treasure, unlike gold or jewels or any material wealth, only grows more valuable when it's shared with others, creating endless ripples of possibility that will continue spreading long after the original story has become legend. The Desert Treasure Widow had found her greatest treasure of all, the immortal legacy of a life lived without limits and dedicated to proving that extraordinary potential exists within every human being, waiting to be discovered by those braves enough to dig for it. The story was complete, but the impact would continue forever, inspiring generations of people to take their own $400 gambles on impossible dreams and discover treasures beyond their wildest imagination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.